Heathen populations are growing in numbers daily, but we are not reaching them, much less matching their increasing numbers with increased efforts to bring them the gospel. Not only are heathen populations growing, but with the frontiers of civilization forging ahead and education advancing, superstition and idolatry are breaking down. Now is the time, as never before, to reach men whose minds are swept cold of old barriers. Our answer last year to this challenge of the pagan millions was less than 2 cents a week for foreign missions from the average Protestant in the United States. And this year we are giving even less. I'm thinking now of that section of the Protestant church which we would call conservative and fundamental. Those who would rise up in quick denial should they be called modernistic. Our own people. And we seem to have lost the happy spirit of fellowship with one another. We have not that abounding life, and we seem to have lost the happy spirit of fellowship with one another, and the joy of God in which ought to make us an attraction to the unsaved. Our prayer meetings have lost the place and power they once had, and many of our people know not the joy of winning others for the Lord. Instead of reaching out for the unsaved, great numbers of our churches are holding on to what they have. Complaints are being made about the deadness and lack of interest among our church members. They tell us that our young people who have been brought up in the church are hard to hold. But is it any wonder? How can a dead and dry orthodoxy, lacking the joy and power of true Christianity, ever hope to hold its own? We've been guilty of acting more like the beleaguered garrison of a doomed fortress than like the soldiers of our conquering Christ. Surely our churches call for men and women to faithfully labor in the word and doctrine. For every Christian, there is this challenge of man's need and of God's command to make all haste in the propagation of the gospel. Let us be sure that we are engaged in what is really His work. And then, despite the difficulties, the remembrance of His faithfulness in the past will give us renewed hope and courage for the future. People of God, does it not thrill our hearts today to realize that we do not answer such a challenge in our own strength? Think of it. God Himself is with us, for our captain, the Lord of hosts, is present in every person, in every battle of conflict, to engage us and to fight for us. With such a captain who never lost a battle, or deserted a soldier in distress, or failed to get through the needed supplies, who would not accept the challenge to go forward, bearing precious seed?
In 1934, John and Betty Stam were new missionaries to China, with a 3-month-old daughter. The town's magistrate came to the Stams and warned them that the communists were coming for them. After John confirmed this, the Stams prepared to leave. However, the communists caught up to the Stams, and when the soldiers did, they demanded all the money the Stams had, and it was handed over. The communists then arrested John and took him to their headquarters. The soldiers later came back and took Betty and Helen. Betty and Helen were taken to be with John. That night, John Stam wrote a letter to CIM authorities, but it was never delivered. The letter was found later bundled up in some of Helen's clothes. It stated that the Stams were being held by the communists for a ransom of $20,000. John Stam also wrote to the mission authorities of how he and his wife had been captured, then wrote Philippians 1:20, "May Christ be glorified, whether by life or death." John, Betty, and Helen were then taken to a local prison where some of the prisoners were released to make room for the Stams. In the midst of the hustle and bustle, Helen started crying, and a soldier suggested that they kill her, since she was only in their way. Then one of the prisoners, who had just been released, asked why they should kill the innocent baby. The soldiers turned to him and asked if he was willing to die for the foreign baby. The man was hacked to pieces for Helen in front of the Stams' eyes. Thus, Helen was allowed to live. The next morning, the Stams were forced to march 12 miles with the soldiers to the town of Miyaosho. The group stopped for a night, and Betty was allowed to tend to Helen, but in fact, Betty instead hid her daughter in the room inside a sleeping bag. The very next morning, John and Betty were being marched down the streets of Miyaosho to meet their deaths. Curious onlookers lined both sides of the streets. A Chinese shopkeeper stepped out of the crowd and talked to the communists, trying to persuade them not to kill the stamps. The soldier ordered the man back into the crowd, but he wouldn't step back. The soldiers then invaded his house, where they found a Chinese copy of the Holy Bible and a hymn book. He was then led alongside the Stams to be killed as well for being a Christian. After marching for a short while longer, John was ordered to kneel, and he was beheaded. Betty and the shopkeeper were killed moments later.